Okay, now let's start talking about the change in supply. Now, the quantity supplied in the market also depends on some non-price factors. Remember when I said law of supply looks at the positive relationship between price and quantity, other factors in the market staying the same. So what happens if we relax that assumption of other factors staying the same? What if we consider these other factors in the market to change when own price of the commodity stays constant? So now the implicit assumption is that own price of the commodity is constant or unchanged, and what is changing is those non-price factors in the market. Now one more thing, the non-price factors in the market from the seller's perspective is not same as the ones from the buyer's perspective, and it always helps me by remembering these non-price factors on the supply side by a word. And once again, you will not find this word in any textbook, and this word has no significance outside this class. So if you go outside and someone asks you, hey, what shifts the supply curve, and you say it is the ties factors, nobody understands what your ties or your tribe means. Okay, so this is a word that I just coined when I was a student, and it helped me remember it that way. So I'm sharing it with my students so that it helps you, or helps at least some of you. Okay. So these are the factors, the non-price factors, which could cause a change in supply, and we will walk over them and see how they cause a change in supply. Now here T stands for technology. Technology is just the process involved in producing something, in making something. I stands for input. It does not stand for income. If you remember, on the demand side, I was for income of the buyer, but here we are talking about input or ingredients or resources that are used in making something. And we are not just talking about the availability, but we are also talking about the price of this input. So we are talking about price as well as the availability of the inputs. E stands for expectations. Now we are on the seller side, we are on the supply side of the market. So obviously we are talking about the expectation of sellers. And last but not the least, here we have the sellers, and by sellers we mean the number of sellers in the market. So these are the factors that could affect the supply of a good in the market. Now here I want to give you a disclaimer, that is R is also involved here. The related goods that we talked about on the demand side is also included here. If you are picking up a textbook and reading it, then it will talk to you about how related goods, how the price of substitutes and complements affects the supply side of the market. I do not want to confuse you, so to keep things simple, I am not including that on the supply side. However, in the real world, it does affect the supply in the market. But we are not talking about that in that class because I'm keeping it basic. I'm not bringing in that complication in here. Okay, so the non-price factors are these factors which could affect the supply of a good. However, just like the demand side, it is beneficial for you to remember that if any of these factors change with price of the good staying constant such that there is an increase in the supply, then you would see a right shift of the supply curve just like the demand side. And if any of those factors change with price staying constant such that there is a decrease in the supply, then you would see a left shift of the S curve or left shift of the supply curve. Now that is always going to be true. Any increase in supply will cause a right shift of the curve, and any decrease in supply would always cause a left shift of the curve, irrespective of which factor causes the change. Now let's go through these factors. Let's say we have a supply curve, okay, and we are in the market for shirts. Let's say we have moved from the ice cream market to the shirts market. We had the ice cream example on the demand side. Okay, so let's say the initial price of the shirts is P1, and at price P1 the suppliers supply Q1 amount of shirts. Okay, P1 or Q1 could be any number. Now let's say these shirts are being produced with hand loom, right? They are being produced with hand loom machines. So these are machines that were manually driven. People have to kind of operate these machines. Now if there is a technological improvement, and instead of hand looms, if the shirt manufacturer starts using power loom, that is machines which are driven by power instead of manually, then obviously that improvement in technology would help to produce more number of shirts. Now please note, nothing has happened to the price of shirts, but just because of the process changing from hand loom to power loom, just because of that improvement in technology, at that same price more quantity of shirts will now be produced, isn't it? And that could be represented in this diagram only through an increase or a shift of the supply curve to something like S dash, so that now you have a higher quantity supplied in the market. Although please note that nothing has happened to the price of shirts per se, the own price of shirt is constant. Just because of the improvement in technology, there is an increase in supply which is represented by the right shift of the supply curve. Now had there been a disimprovement in technology, then you would see the opposite effect. The supply would go down, and in that case you would see a left shift of the supply curve. Now let's go on to the next factor, which is quite important, that is inputs. So if what is input? First let us understand what is an input. Now an input is anything that goes into making something else. Okay. Now it is quite possible for you to get confused about an input and a complementary good. So please be very careful about the difference between an input and a complementary good. A complementary good is anything that is jointly consumed. Okay, so you have two separate goods, but just that the buyer buys them together, consumes them together. Whereas an input is any commodity that does not maintain its separate identity anymore, but just goes into making that other good. For example, if you're considering, something like soda and sugar, okay. Now it is not like when you drink soda, you also have a fistful of sugar. No, right? So those are not complementary goods, because you're not having soda and sugar together. But sugar goes into making soda, so sugar is really an ingredient or an input for making soda. Or if you consider microchip and computers, right? The microchip goes into making the computer, so it's an input. When you use the computer, the microchip does not maintain a separate identity of its own. Do you see what I'm saying? So please be a little careful about when you're reading the question, and try to understand carefully whether we are talking about a complementary good or really an input. Okay. Now coming back, now when we talk about inputs, the availability is important, and the price of the input is also important. Now if the input is easily available, then obviously it will be easier for the producer to produce the good, and hence his supply will increase. So higher availability implies higher supply, and lower availability means lower supply. Okay, so higher availability of the input implies a right shift of the supply curve, and lower availability of the input refers to a left shift of the supply curve. That is pretty intuitive. Now let's go and talk about the input price, and let us call the price of input as P input. Okay. Now if the price of the input is higher, for example in our example shirts, maybe cotton fabric. If you are talking about cotton shirts, then cotton fabric is an input. You need cotton fabric to make cotton shirts. So if the price of cotton fabric is higher, it means that the cost of producing the shirts is higher. The cost of production will be higher, and if the cost of production is higher, then for a rational producer, it just makes sense to produce less, and hence the supply will be lower. So as a result of higher input price, we will see a decrease in supply, which would be represented by a leftward shift on this diagram. So holding the price of shirts constant, you would see a left shift of the supply curve to something like S double dash. And that is happening because of the change in input price. Please do not get confused. This price is the price of shirts. This price is the price of cotton fabric. So this price is the price of your commodity. This price is the price of the input that we are talking about. So the price of shirt constant, if the input price changes, you see a shift of supply. Now the opposite would happen if the price of input went down. If the price of input became cheaper, then cost of producing would be lower, and as a result of that you would see a decrease in you would see an increase in supply, and hence a right shift of the supply curve to something like S dash that you see on the diagram, to something like S dash. Okay, so pretty intuitive. Higher input price means lower supply, lower input price means higher supply. Okay, these are things for you to remember, because when we go on to problem solving, you will see that these are the relationships that you will use for solving your problems. Okay, now next let us talk about expectation of the sellers. Once again, when we talk about expectation of the sellers, we are talking about their expectations about own price in the future. Now once again, that qualifies as a non-price factor, because the price today, the actual price of the commodity today is not changing, but what is changing is the expectation of the seller about the price in the future. Okay, so let's say I am a seller and I know that the goods will become expensive in the future. So if I am a rational person, and remember in economics we do not deal with any crazy people. Okay, we always assume in economics that everyone is rational. We have nothing to do with crazy people, although me personally I don't have anything against them, but you know, that's just how the discipline is. We assume everyone is rational. Okay, so for rational seller, if we know that the price is going to be higher in the future, it just makes sense not to supply today, but wait until the prices actually become higher. So we could say that if own price in the future is going to be higher, then my supply today is going to be lower. For any rational seller, that will be true, and that would be represented by a left shift, something like S double dash that you see in the figure. Okay, and similarly, if the seller knows that own price will be lower in the future, if own price was going to be lower in the future, then as a rational seller, I will try to sell off today, supply today, so that I can make more money, because I know prices will drop in the future. So today I would supply more, and that would be represented through a right shift of the supply curve today. Okay. So for example, if you are a bakery person, you own a bakery, right? So you know what you're making is perishable. It's a perishable item. Your bread that you're baking or cake that you're baking is a perishable item. So you know that if your product goes stale over time, then it's probably going to lose its value and the price is going to drop. Nobody will want to buy stale bread or stale cake. Everyone likes fresh bread, right? So you know the prices will become cheaper as your goods becomes more stale, or it is, you know, the time passes. So you rather want to sell it off today, so you are going to supply more of the fresh bread today. So today there will be a higher supply of the fresh bread. That is exactly what we are talking about. Now this one once again is pretty simple. If you have more sellers in the market, then there will be more quantity supplied. If there are less sellers in the market, there will be less quantity supplied, and hence you will see a left shift of the supply curve. Please note, nothing is happening to the price per se, the price is constant, but just because you have more sellers, there is more supply, you have less sellers, there is less supply. So I hope you have been able to understand how these non-price factors are affecting the supply in the market, and they are affecting the supply with the implicit assumption that nothing is changing on the y-axis. The price of the good is constant. So now these non-price factors are also called the supply shifters, and all this change in the supply curve, the shift of the supply curve to the right or to the left, this is known as change in supply. So please note that change in supply refers to a shift of the supply curve. So now, with all the discussion that we have done in the last couple of videos and in this video, I hope you understand that law of demand and law of supply have nothing to do with the shift of the demand or supply curve. The law of demand or the law of supply is talking about the price and the quantity relationship from the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective. So they are basically talking about the movement along the demand or the supply curve. They have nothing to do with the shifts, right? The shifts of the supply curve or the shifts of the demand curve are caused by the non-price factors in the market, and those are not referring to the law of demand or to the law of supply. So with that, we have come to the end of module 2 unit 1. Now in unit 2, we are still on module 2, but in unit 2, we are going to bring the demand side and the supply side together, and we will look at the different dynamics in the market.